Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to the first Zelt and Zinc partnership webinar. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. Just a few housekeeping bits and pieces. You'll see on the right-hand side, you've got a couple of things. You've got the chat. Please feel free to chat and ask questions live if you like. If you'd like a bit more of a formal Q&A, which we'll get to at the end, there's a Q&A tab, and we'll also be doing a couple of polls. And I think you'll probably have to go to the poll tabs to see those, but I'll let you know when I'm launching it. I'm a little croaky. I've had a bit of the old COVID. If my voice squeaks or disappears at a particular point, I do apologize. I will do my best. I have a glass of water, but it's an absolute pleasure to have you all here. Just a couple of introductions, I guess. I'm Patrick. I'm the VP of Sales at Zinc. Zinc is an automated background checking solution. We've got about 500 customers, and we basically take all your right to work, criminal checks, and all that sort of thing, and make sure that it's just a click of a button that comes back very quickly. And with me, I have Daniel. Daniel, do you want to introduce yourself and Zelt as well?
Hey everyone. Yeah, my name's Dan. I head up operations at Zelt, and yeah, Zelt gives companies one place to manage their HR, payroll, and IT across their employee lifecycle. So helps teams consolidate systems, automate manual tasks, and ultimately provide a better employee experience. And I think if I'm right in saying it's Happy HR Professionals Day today to any HR professionals on the call. So happy HR Day, whatever you're doing for that, joining our webinar, which is good.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't know that. Who decided it was Happy HR? Who decides any of these days?
I know.
Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, Happy HR Professionals Day, everyone. We'll just give a minute or two for people to come back into the call. And while we're waiting, we're just going to do a little poll. So this is my first time using this platform, so apologies if it goes wrong. But just to help us sort of customize everything, I've launched a poll. If you go to polls, you should now be able to answer. If you can't, let me know. But the question is why are you here today? Is it here because you're sort of overwhelmed with the admin of onboarding? You want to speed it up? You want to improve the candidate experience, or perhaps a bit of all of it? Maybe it's some of it's, oh yeah, people are answering, which means they can. Let's just let that filter through for a couple of seconds. It's interesting. It seems to be mostly towards a bit of all of them, but a particular emphasis on people for candidate experience. Which is very interesting. So it seems to be mostly a candidate experience crowd with a little bit of everything else. That's fantastic. Well, we will get going then. And as I said, pleasure to have you all here today. So we're going to go to, first of all, the agenda. We're just going to first look at, Dan's going to talk through sort of onboarding legislation. And secondly, we're going to dip into background checking 101, so the right to work, criminal checks, reference employment verification. We'll both try to put a particular emphasis on the candidate experience. We'll then have a little bit of a look at the status quo and then the future. So Dan, over to you.
Oh yeah. So first thing around sort of onboarding efficiently is being aware of various different legislation that you'll sort of have to tackle as you start onboarding. First things to call out is just around employment classification types and making sure everyone's sort of aware of what they are and what they actually mean. So first one is a worker, and this is someone who has a contract, but someone who might work 0 hours as a freelancer. Typically, they don't have minimum notice periods. As a result of this, they're not entitled to protection against unfair dismissal. They're not entitled to the right to request flexible working. This differs to an employee, and this is typically someone who will work a set number of hours. They're entitled to join the pension schemes. In their employment contracts, it'll set out statutory redundancy pay, statutory maternity leave. They're entitled to holiday entitlements as well. Next classification type is self-employed. And this is typically someone who submits an invoice, is responsible for their own work. They're not entitled to holiday pay. And this is probably the first one where there's a bit of a bit of point to be aware of. So a lot of companies, especially a lot of startups, and people on this call might do this as well, is hiring contractors as self-employed workers. So first thing to be aware of here is, piece of legislation which is called IR35. And really what IR35 is a hiccup point, as we'll see in the next slide, for several companies that has been high profile in the news over recent years, like Uber and quite possibly Nike soon. IR35 deems whether or not somebody who is working in a freelance or contractor point of view, are they inside or are they outside of IR35? And what that means is if they're inside, they pay the same tax, so they pay the same PAYE as an employee. If they're outside, then they're deemed to be operating as a genuine business, and they can draw down salary, draw down dividends, etc. You as an employer don't have to put them through PAYE. In terms of how to determine that, so gov.uk have a very handy sort of checklist, and if possible, we'll try and send this round after the call. But essentially from 2021, April 2021, if you're a medium or large company, and I believe that's determined by if you have, I think, around 50 employees, if your revenue's over $10 million, £10 million, sorry, or your balance sheet's over £5 million, you are now responsible for making this assessment. So you have the burden to make sure that you're classifying your contractors correctly. If you don't fall in that category and you're a small business, it then falls onto the contractor themselves to determine whether or not they're inside or outside of IR35. But yeah, as you can see on the screen now, the impact of that can be quite severe. So Uber is one that's been in the news quite consistently for their employee classifications. So not only, I think this court case was 2021, 2016. So not only was it a benefit from an employee perspective that they were able, from the worker perspective, they're able to then be misclassified. Once they were then reclassified, they were able to be entitled to some of those benefits that I mentioned. From a fine perspective, Uber essentially were classifying people as self-employed so that they could avoid being classed as a delivery company, which then allowed them to avoid VAT. So as a result of that, they then had a £1 billion penalty that they then had to pay retrospectively back to HMRC. Similarly with Nike, they have both across the US, Netherlands, UK, around 80,000 people that they've been classifying as self-employed, as contractors, and the UK government, US government is now cracking down on that. And the impact for them, again, is equally severe. They are having to potentially have to back pay the taxes that they should have paid on those workers that they didn't do. So whilst for the people on this call, the penalties won't be as severe as 530 million or $1 billion, it's important to make sure that if you fall into that large category, that you're doing those checks, and if not, you're making sure that the people that are working for you are also being diligent and making sure that they're classifying themselves correctly, because you don't want to have any of these potential penalties fall upon you. Next slide, please, Paddy. So next bits to run through. So agreements and contracts. So what's the difference between an employment contract versus a written statement? So Employment Rights Act, I think this was 1996, this sets out that anybody classed as a worker or an employee that we've just gone through above, they must have what's called a written statement of employment particulars. And this is split into two parts. So there's a principal statement, which has to be given to anyone who's an employee or a worker by day one of their employment. And this includes, as you can see, things like name, contract length, probation periods, what holiday entitlement they have, etc. Then by their second week in employment, they have to have a full written statement. And this includes things like pension scheme details, any rights to non-compulsory training, collective agreements. So collective agreements might be, again, in larger companies, things that unions have agreed collectively around certain conditions. And also in this written statement, there must be disciplinary and grievance procedures added as well. So I think it's interesting to call out because obviously employment contracts are typically what employers will send out. But it's actually not mandatory to send out the things that are in the employment contract. It's the first two elements, and by those dates, that you have to send them out to your new hires. And as we come through to the onboarding and how you can do that more efficiently, sending those out prior to employment just makes life a lot easier. In terms of then employment contracts, so what's typically included then on top of that, so businesses will then tend to add things on top of the principal statements and the written statements, GDPR requirements, code of conduct, any NDAs that you might want to sign, as well as maybe options agreements as well. Next slide, please. Cool. So next bit around onboarding and I guess the legislation to be aware of is payroll and pension. So question is who to put through payroll. So this is anyone that's earning more than £533 a month or £6,396 a year. Anyone who's classified as an employee or a worker that we've gone through above, or any students or temporary workers. Next slide, please. So what information should employees give you? So typically you'll get this through P45s. And again, when we come to that, show you how to get that more efficiently. And this will be things like full name. You'll need their leaving dates from their previous role, any student loan deductions, national insurance number, existing tax code. If you don't have P45s, a new starter checklist is typically sent out. This replaced a few years ago what was then called a P46 form, which essentially allows you to get information from employees who might not have a P45 yet because their old employer has yet to share it. Next slide, please. Who should you then enroll in pension? So again, another bit to be aware of and something that you don't want to have to do after you've made that decision to hire. So this is anyone who's aged 22 or over, under the state pension age, they're earning more than 10K a year, and they are working within the UK. Next slide. And then pension contributions. Again, something that you have to, if someone meets those enrollment criteria, something you have to be aware of is, again, the total minimum contribution that has to go into their pension plan. So again, the total minimum is 8%, and that's split down into an employee minimum of 5% and an employer minimum of 3%. After that, it's discretionary around if an employee wants to raise it to 10% and you want to match up to X, or you want to match up to 10, entirely up to you. Things that can be laid down in contracts, things that can be laid down in handbooks, but 8% and that split is the mandatory minimum that you will have to offer. Next slide. Awesome. Pass over to you.
Excellent. Apologies. I was just muted it because I was coughing and spluttering. So I see a question from Philip whether this is going to be UK focused throughout. Yes, it will be. Apologies if it's less relevant to you, but it will be pretty UK focused, not entirely, but largely over the next sort of 20-25 minutes or so. So, I mean, obviously part of onboarding, which is becoming a bigger and bigger part of onboarding, is the background checking side of things. And absolutely everyone does background checking of some sort in the UK, because you do right to work checks, which obviously are a legal requirement. But actually it's a much broader collection of things: your references, your employment verification, criminal, media, social. There's an absolute huge number of them. And the trends are really interesting. And I guess what's interesting is, because we're having to do more and more of them, it's how they affect candidate experience, which is typically not in a particularly good way. So in terms of the general trends, in 2022, the number of organizations doing background checks, not including right to work, but other background checks, went from 60% to 78% in the UK. So a huge uptick. The number of checks being done a year went from 4.3 million to 6 million. And the number of criminal checks actually went up by 500%, which is pretty extraordinary, really, because we don't have more schools and more hospitals, sadly. This has entirely been driven by the private sector. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but one of the most sort of telling, I guess, is, and why more are happening, is how often do people lie on their CV? So 21 to 35%, depending on which bit of research you believe, have lied about their education on their CV, and 31 to 39% have lied about their experience. Now, these might not be dramatic lies. They might be upgrading coaching to line management, or perhaps rather than worked on a project, saying they've led a project. But it seems to be happening more to the point people are catching it more and more. Now, interestingly, for those who had lied, 43% said the lie directly contributed to their success in getting the role. So it's interesting to ask what the sneakiest sector is. Who is being the most dishonest? Well, you'll be hugely relieved to hear that medicine is the most honest, with only 2% of lies detected. Unfortunately, the most dishonest are media, marketing, and advertising. So obviously, take everything I say with a pinch of salt. But even among the angels, there's some pretty publicized examples of people being a little bit dishonest or very dishonest, and lying their ways into big jobs. Now, the reason I sort of illustrate it with that is it sort of ties into why the number of checks are increasing so quickly. And if they're increasing so quickly, what then do we do about it from a candidate experience point of view? So one of the reasons it's increasing so quickly is the legislative and regulatory change. So many of you will be aware of dramatic changes in how you prove your right to work in the UK over the last year. We'll go into that in a bit of depth. But there's also new regulations in different industries like finance, healthcare. More and more of us are voluntarily signing up to things like SOC 2 or ISO 27001, things to do with sort of data protection, which mean that as part of getting those sort of stamps of approval, we're expected to do various checks on our employees. So that's a huge driver in the increase. The second is brand vulnerability and risk management. So obviously now, sadly, when we make mistakes, it is usually played out very publicly and very embarrassingly on Twitter or X or whatever it's called at the moment, and other social media platforms. There's also risk management is a lot less laissez-faire. Deloitte did a giant study looking at the priorities of C-level execs in the FTSE 250 and the FTSE 100, and nearly all of them put risk management in their top 5 concerns. We've gone through obviously a decade of sort of crashes and crunches and difficulties in COVID, and people now are just a little bit more careful and want to manage risk a bit more carefully. Third thing is remote work. Now, we could never actually tell if people had a criminal record just by meeting them in person, but I think to a certain extent we felt like we could. So with the increase in remote work, people have got more diligent about doing background checks. And finally, there's a bit of a look you find, a sort of self-perpetuating snowball. Now, when 53% of organizations have found discrepancies once they've started doing background checks, it makes them likely to do more checks. If you start checking people for some things, and then you find things that you wish you'd known, you start doing more and more checks. And so with all this sort of huge increase in background checking, there's a tendency, as we do more checks, we find more issues, so we do more checks. It's kind of sort of self-perpetuates and sort of drives itself forward. Now, getting it wrong can be a bit, in the onboarding process, can actually be a little bit painful. I hope no one on this call used to work for Byron. I apologise if you do, to use it as an example, but you may remember this example in the UK news. Byron Berger had been not checking the right to work properly of the people working in its restaurants. Now, the Home Office obviously got in touch and said, you guys are in trouble, help us find all these people, or you could go to prison. And we'll talk about the consequences of getting it wrong in a little bit. And so what they did is Byron Berger sent out a memo to all of its restaurant workers, those they thought were working here illegally, and told them they needed to come to the store in Holborn to learn a new burger recipe. Now, when they came to learn said burger recipe, Home Office officials swooped in, arrested them all, and deported them. Now, this was obviously dramatic. Not only did Byron get massive fines, but it actually completely destroyed their reputation. It was not seen as having acted well. To be honest, they should never have got themselves into that position in the first place. But by not onboarding properly, by not doing the background checks properly, they got themselves into a bit of a pickle. And it's very public. If, for example, on right to work, you don't onboard people properly, and if you get fined, it'll turn up on a government website saying the business, how much you've been fined for. It's all very public and all very embarrassing. So it's a vital part of your onboarding to do these sorts of checks properly. Now, I'm just going to touch on 3 checks. There's lots that you can do, but these are the ones that I think are most important to get done properly. either in the cases of right to work, because if you don't do it properly, you get into huge amounts of trouble, but also because they can present a sort of massive hindrance to the speed of onboarding people, but also the candidate experience. It can be very painful when you've invested so much time, energy, and money into making a really slick candidate onboarding experience, and then they suddenly have to hand over sheets of documents, and it gets all very complicated. So first off, right to work. I hope everyone on this call is now quite confident about how right to work works in the UK. You probably know that the legislation changed about a year ago, but just a bit of a 101. In the UK, all employers are required by law to check that their employees have the right to work in the UK before you employ them. If you knowingly employ someone or have reasonable cause to believe that you can't employ them, it can result into 5 years in prison and an unlimited fine. Now, as HR professionals, there's not actually many things we can do on a day-to-day basis that gets us into that level of trouble. So it's something taking very, very seriously. Even if you're not intentionally doing it, or no one believes that you're intentionally doing it, not doing the proper check or doing it improperly, your business can face a fine up to £60,000 per non-compliant worker, and you lose the right to sponsor visas, which can actually be devastating for some businesses. So it's really, really important to get this right when you're doing the onboarding. And what you're trying to get is your statutory excuse. This is the thing that basically shows that you've done your bit properly. And as a result, no matter what happens after, as long as you've shown that you've done your bit properly, you're not going to be in trouble. So this has changed dramatically in the last year. A year ago, largely due to COVID, which I am now croaking through still, you could check people's documents over a video call. You could accept scanned documents or a photo of documents using an email or mobile app rather than sending the originals. And if they couldn't prove it, you could just send them off to the Home Office website and they could prove it in other ways. Now, this has expired. To get your statutory excuse now, you've got to do the following. You've got to do an in-person right to work check with their physical documentation right in front of you. You've got to pick copies of the documents and store them for 2 years after employment. And you are responsible to check that the document appears valid and that the person is who they say they are. The second way you can do it is you can check someone over video if they've sent their physical documentation to you through the post, like their passport. I cannot recommend highly enough that you do not do this. We've had calls from businesses who've got themselves into horrible trouble, losing passports, sending back and forth between the office. It's not a responsibility that you want, sending passports back and forth through the mail. I really, really recommend you don't go this route. The third route, and the most interesting, is, and this has only been introduced in the last year or two, is an IDSP, which I'll explain what it is in a moment, can check British and Irish passports using identity technology remotely. Guidelines are to use someone on the government trust framework. Now, an IDSP is an identity service provider. There's organizations that can provide identity verification using technology remotely. You don't have to see them in person. So Zinc is one of these, for example. The fourth is if someone doesn't have an English or Irish passport, they can use something called the share code scheme. So if they're applying to work in the UK from France or Israel or anywhere else, they can get a share code, which is a 9-digit number, which allows, in a post-Brexit world, people to prove their right to work. You can double check it on the government website that it's valid. So ironically, if you're not using an IDTV, it's actually easier to check someone's right to work if they are coming from abroad than actually if they are a British or Irish citizen, ironically. Now, companies like Zinc can actually check these on your behalf, but actually you are supposed to redo it when they join to gain your statutory excuse. And the final way is there are other forms of way of doing it. So, for example, you can use a birth certificate plus a national insurance number. But again, this creates quite a high burden on you. You've got to see that documentation with that person in person. People like Zinc can validate the documents for you, but you do have to recheck them when they come in. So it's all got rather complicated. By far the easiest way these days is to use that IDSP route where they can do almost everything for you. In terms of what people, for example, in London are applying to do at the moment, if we look at the last 2,000 right to work checks done on Zinc, about 21% were share codes, 3.5% were birth certificates, but the vast majority of people were using a British or Irish passport. Now, the next one is the criminal checks. Now, I'd be absolutely fascinated to know, of those on the call, who is actually doing a criminal check. So I'm going to just open up a little poll that you can see. Oh, no, that's the wrong poll. Don't worry about that. But if you are using criminal checks, just have a little chat, put something in the chat. I think most organizations these days are doing criminal checks for at least some roles. So people working in their finance departments, senior hires, that sort of thing. But the most interesting thing really is you can do a criminal check on everyone. You can do a basic criminal check on everyone and how quickly they're increasing. So there's 4 different types of criminal check you can do in the UK. If you do the wrong one on the wrong person, that is actually not legal. So you need to make sure that you're doing the right sort of check on the right sort of role. So Jackie, you just said you're doing enhanced check. Enhanced with barring, this is people working in healthcare, working with children or adults. So maybe, for example, a cleaner in a school or someone working in social care. Enhanced with barring, really the only way that you can do this or should do this is if someone is involved looking after vulnerable adults or children. Interestingly, just enhanced without the barring. So the barring bit is these child and adult lists. Is very niche. Not actually many businesses can or should do just enhanced without the barring. Examples include working with the Gambling Commission or the National Lottery, taxi drivers, some particular government roles. It's a bit niche. A lot more of you will do standard. And standard is directors as businesses bidding for public contracts, FCA regulated persons, accountants, or solicitors or legal executives. But the one that most businesses, or a lot of businesses, are doing, this is the one where it's seen this 500% increase over the last 5 years, is the basic. And you can do this on any member of staff. Now, it's interesting, I guess, to quickly see what is done, what actually this means in terms of what it's checking. So for basic, it's just unspent convictions. So when you commit a crime, you're convicted, there's sort of a time limit on it in which it will turn up in a basic criminal check. The second is standard, which will also include spent convictions and cautions. Enhanced includes police intelligence, and that enhanced with barring includes that children's barring and adult barring lists. So what's driven this 500% increases in criminal checks? Why are more and more businesses doing it as part of their onboarding as standard? Despite the obvious downsides of its extra admin for the candidates, its extra expense, its extra difficulty. Well, part of it is this you look, you find. 2% of basic checks and over 5% of enhanced checks uncover something. And as people have started to do more criminal checks and uncovered stuff, they feel that they should be checking more and more. The second is the sort of reputation and legal risk. If you employ someone with a criminal record who then acts improperly, you may face legal action from service users, other employees. I'll give a couple of examples. If you employ someone with an unspent conviction in racially aggravated assault or sexual harassment, you put them in your team, and then they act in that way to a member of your team, and then it comes out, it can put you in a very, very sticky spot. Secondly, if you hire someone who's got a history of white collar crime or theft, fraud, and then they do that to your company, it can affect things like the insurance company's willingness to pay out, all sorts of things. So there is a lot of risk not having done your due diligence on this kind of thing. And I mean, at the most basic level, it can turn up embarrassingly in the media as well. Now, I guess the third aspect is protecting your business. So estimates put revenue lost to fraud on average at 5%. And finally, I guess one of the biggest drivers is us voluntarily signing up to these different standards to say, to basically show that we're doing our due diligence. So like SOC 2, ISO 27001, SMCR. If you're a business that needs these accreditations in order to sell to various customers or to access insurance, whatever it happens to be, you end up having to do that. And all these sort of combinations together mean that it's increasing significantly, and it's probably going to continue doing so. If your organization doesn't do or isn't required to do some sort of criminal check now, I would be willing to bet a good dinner or a good drink with any of you that in 5 years, if your organization is more than sort of 100 people, it will be doing it in 5 years. But interestingly, though, I suppose the combination with that is that 50% of employers wouldn't employ someone with a criminal record. But 27% of working adults have a criminal conviction of some sort, even though it's down to a caution, increasing to 33% when you're just looking at men. So it's not something that we can necessarily take. Most companies should have a policy. You shouldn't absolutely turn away anyone with any form of criminal record. You should have a policy in place to help you understand how to navigate whatever conviction happens to turn up. So sort of a tentative conclusion is knowing if someone has a criminal record before hiring them is a good call from a business risk, brand, and arguably a moral perspective, protecting your members of staff and your customers. But what you do with that information is up to you. No one is suggesting that you should write off anyone who's ever made that kind of mistake in their past. But it gets really complicated. So there's legal ramifications if you get it wrong. If you hire a non-UK national, there's 194 other countries to think about. So talk to an expert. Probably something you should do, but probably someone you should get some advice on. And finally, looking at, I guess, the final piece of the puzzle is the employment verification and references. Now, I expect nearly all of you do some sort of reference for employment verification. These can sort of vary from sort of full-on character references to simply just checking that if you've hired someone on the basis of their experience, that they have actually done what they've said they've done in their past. Excuse me, my voice is definitely starting to go. I think I can just about get through. So how good are references at spotting talent? Now, this is a list, basically the different types of assessments and how effective they are, how good they are, according to the biggest study ever done on this, Schmidt and Hunter. It's a meta-analysis, there's lots of studies, and how good they are at predicting people are going to be good. And the answer to the reference checks is they're okay, but they're not great. They're slightly better than years of experience, years of education, but they're nothing like as good as structured interviews or work sample tests. So why do people do it? Why do people still do references or employment verification? Well, there's a couple of answers. Some people have to do them. If you are a regulated business, like a healthcare business or FCA regulated, so Financial Conduct Authority, you have to do them. It's part of your responsibility to check people have done what they have said they've done. And I guess that's the second part. It doesn't necessarily have to be about checking if someone's good at the job, but simply if you've hired someone on the basis, partly on the basis of experience, you should probably check that they've done what they said they did. It's kind of an integrity check. So they actually did the job, and that's sort of an employment verification or HR reference, but also the scope of the responsibilities match up. And this is a big one. This is where most of the porkies, most of the dishonesty comes in. It's not people entirely fabricating jobs on their CV, although that does happen and happens quite a lot. It's people upgrading that line management experience from coaching or exaggerating their responsibilities in a particular project. And that's the bit worth checking. People do still check ability. They want to see how good a candidate was. It's not the most predictive, but people do still do it. So that might be checking skills, checking culture fit, traits such as resilience or team working. And fourth, the onboarding and management part. So enhancing the onboarding and management. So that might be asking how they learn, what motivates them, what makes them happy. It's not trying to work out if they're good at the job or not, but just to help you manage them better when they join. Excuse me. So if we think of the first category, more than did they work where they said they did, if we want to check that they had the scope of responsibilities, we can ask questions like this. Did candidates hit their targets consistently while they were working with you? Now, I hire salespeople mostly, and even not very good salespeople often are very, very good at selling themselves. So this is a really important question. Can you describe what their line management responsibilities were in the role? Could you describe what they were responsible for in their final role with you? It's all these things just like checking the scope of their responsibility. Constantina, is face-to-face ID verification still compulsory if Zinc has completed the online verification? That's an interesting one. If that's all right, I'll come to that one at the end, and I can go into what that looks like. So if we wanted to check someone's abilities, how can we use structure to improve the validity? And a little hint can be seen how we've improved interviewing by moving from unstructured interviews to structured interviews. And the same thing can be done with reference checks. So rather than just asking asking different bits, asking random questions, you do all the same things you do with structured interviews. You do multiple references to combat bias. Use structured questioning, and I'll give some examples. Use reference information as an additive to onboarding development assessment rather than determinative. What I mean by that is you shouldn't get carried away and sort of give someone or not give someone the job on the basis of a single reference. And you also need to make it as painless as possible for both the candidates and the referees. You need to automate it. You need to ask the right questions. So some good examples for skills-based reference would be something like this. How would you rate the candidate SQL skills? Give them a rating, 1 to 5, and you ask them if they can add anything. Similarly for management, how would you rate the candidate's ability to motivate their teams when things are tough? You can see you're just, rather than asking if someone was good or someone was bad, you're getting some little of structure in it and sort of improving that validity, removing bias, and making it a bit more objective. So Daniel, perfect timing because my voice is about to go. I'm going to hand over to you for a little quiz.
Thank you. We'll give Patrick a quick break. Hopefully get some water in. Cool, yeah, so I think let's maybe use the chat function. So we've got some what we deem to be shocking onboarding facts that we hope you'll be equally shocked by. And first one is, how many tasks on average does it take a new joiner have to complete when they start a new role? So any guesses in the chat? I'll give you a clue. It's double digits. Can I see any coming through? We got 20, 25, 38, 30, 10, 15, 14. No. Shockingly, it is, how many? Next slide. 54. There we go. So that's 54 on average, 54 tasks that a new joiner has to complete. I think when we go through shortly, sort of around how we can improve that, that'll be typically things like emails back and forth, documents being sent, doing like right to work checks, enrolling into payroll. So this is a lot of admin that a new joiner has to do. And ultimately our aim is, can we get that down as close to, 0 as possible? Obviously there's some things that we have to do and we should be doing. And with those ones that we still have left, how can we automate them? Next question. So what is the average time that people managers tend to spend on onboarding admin for each new hire? So I think there's some people ops leaders in the call. You've had a sneak peek. If anyone was replying to an email or a Slack message and may not have been looking, feel free to pop in your guess. No, I think everyone. I'll put the no answers down so that everyone's paying attention, which is good.
Sorry, my finger slipped.
So very uncountable, yeah. 3 hours. So again, if you're in a growing company, if you're doing this on scale, those 3 hours can consistently add up. And it seems that here we've got people who are spending even more on that, which is, our aim to see if we can get that down. Next question. What's the percentage of people managers that face access management challenges whilst onboarding? And access management might be things like giving people access to Slack, to Google Workspace, to all the tools that they use. Any guesses?
My guess would be 100%.
I think this 35, yeah. Somewhere in the middle, we're around 40, yeah, it's a close one. 47%, I believe the figure is.
Right, shall I reveal?
Yeah, if you reveal. 47%. Yeah. So some close guesses there. And again, as we come to access management, tends to be some of that, as I guess many people on this call will know, can be one of those tasks in that 3 hours of admin that takes up a lot of the time. And it's not just people ops time, but it's also new hires time. It's also other people around the company that have to spend time giving access to all of these different tools. And that's where we tend to see a lot of challenge when it comes to onboarding. Next one, I think we've got a couple more questions.
Oh, well, this is more of a test to see if people are listening at the beginning. What proportion of people lie on their CV about their work experience? Does anyone dare guess? I'm not going to test people. It's too mean. So if you remember, it was 31 to 39%. Yeah, right in the middle. Perfect. Depends on the research that you look at. Like, there's loads of different research. So I checked about 3 or 4, and they came out between 31 and 39%. And this is, I guess, on the right to work check one. This is the important one, because this is to stop anyone getting into trouble. You can still check someone's right to work documents over video. So you can look at like a video of their passport and say if they have the right to work or not. True or false? Not anymore. Absolutely right. This is the one thing. This is the one thing you should definitely not be doing, because this is the one that will get you into trouble. So yeah, that's false. You can no longer do that.
Cool. So maybe this is a bit too small, this graphic, but just reading out what it says. So going back to that sort of, I guess, access management point. So really just calling out that side of things that in a survey that's done by, I believe, Strong DM, they asked around what's the biggest challenges regarding accessing infrastructure in a company. And the first couple of, in the top sort of 3 there, is around the time it takes to request access. So again, sometimes access for systems isn't trivial. Like if you think about it yourselves, if your CTO or CFO or someone in your C-suite owns the access provisioning for a certain tool, getting them to give access may take some time. And further down there, you can see 47% of the people, which is the one that we called out, said around onboarding new joiners, and they have problems with giving access there. Next slide. Cool. So I guess the question that I guess we've been going through and then and throughout is, why is onboarding processes taking more time than they should? So I think there's probably a number of reasons. I've called out 4 that I think come to mind through businesses that we speak to from using Zelt. And one of the first ones is no pre-boarding or a delay in the onboarding process. And pre-boarding is typically things like making sure that you send contracts out to people. It's going through some of this access stuff. So people, if you don't start this to day one, it slows down that process. You have those challenges that we've mentioned, down to trivial things like if you don't tell people prior to when they start, what time they should turn up on their first day, where they should turn up, what clothes they should wear, all of that in that pre-boarding process is critical to make sure that it's not only sped up for you once they join, but also more importantly, it's sped up for that new hire. And that's, including things like sending laptops as well. Second one calling out is, I guess, a lack of structure and goal setting. So not setting goals during the onboarding phase, that typically can result in quite a bit of what we've seen is confusion or sort of misplaced enthusiasm, I guess, from an employee, in terms of they don't necessarily know in this time period of when I'm onboarding. So pre-onboarding, the first day, first week, first month, what is it that I should be achieving? And not only from the new hires perspective, but also from the people ops perspective and the team that they're joining, they tend not to have, in where we see slow onboarding process, tend not to have these goals defined. And that means that people do tasks that they don't need to do straight away. They ignore things that they should be doing straight away. And ultimately, it then leads to a lot of wasted energy and a lot of duplication going through tasks over and over again. And that could be, training material done at the wrong point of time, a meeting with someone when they're not ready to do it, so on and so forth. Another one to call out is information overload. So similar to the above, it's sort of not uncommon for new joiners to have, I guess, wads of information passed to them on day one. If you're a growing company and you're onboarding lots and lots of people in a short period of time, people on this call will face that challenge of how do you get people in, how do you get them set up, and how do you get them ready to be successful at their job. And sometimes what we see is that day one typically becomes a hyper-intensive crash course in the business that's not a good use of time for the people who have to go and deliver that, but also more importantly, not for the new hire. So typically we might see that they have, an induction meeting, a health and safety meeting, an overview with their manager around the goals for the next year, an intro with 4 peers, a team lunch, maybe a meeting with the CEO. All of that's done in day one. And what that then means is that for the rest of that onboarding journey, which typically can last, and should last, post 90 days, they end up having to relearn, re-go through, and not be set up correctly and not be set up properly to achieve and be successful in their role. So that's typically another problem that we see. And I guess, and I've highlighted this in red, is the thing that tends to slow onboarding down the most, and both from a admin and a new hire perspective, is manual processes and I guess a fragmented tool stack. So I think on average, organizations tend to run around 16 HR tools. And this is typically due to the fact that as SaaS products and the SaaS markets have grown, HR vendors have tended to then focus more narrower onto a specific part of people operations. So you have very good HRIS systems, very good expense management tools, very good performance management software, and so on and so forth. And that's the reason why we then see this fragmentation of companies' people operations tool stack. And what that then can leave with is you typically will see, and again, if you ask your own onboarding process, you'll typically see something that might look like this, right? You have a contract that's signed, and that might be through a dedicated e-signing tool. So that's one system. You then have to add your data to your HRIS manually into the system. People ask for documents. We've gone through passports, etc., that Patrick's gone through manually over email, chased over email. You then have payroll onboarding, and that might look like HR asking again over email for a new hire to send that P45 or new starter checklist that we mentioned they have to do. That's then manually sent to finance or manually added to a payroll system. Devices, so making sure that your new hire has a device. Typically, that could then be via, again, HR manually going in and ordering it, manually in maybe larger companies where there's IT functions going in and asking them to order it, shipping it out, setting it up. That can be around 1 hour per each device. And if you're onboarding at scale, that time quickly adds up. And software access as well that we've mentioned, going into each of these tools manually, creating those accounts manually, asking people to create access. So these are just a few steps in, I guess, a typical onboarding process that, as you can see and as you ask yourself, can be very manual, can be spread across multiple different systems, and ultimately result in the amount of time that you have to spend on onboarding a new hire. Next slide.
So I suppose this is the flip side to that, which is why doing checks, and by that it could be right to work, references, it's got so hard. I mean, a lot of it is it's the same thing that Dan said. The status quo takes 2 to 3 weeks to turn around someone's references, their right to work, criminal checks. It's roughly about 90 minutes of admin per candidate if you're doing more than one, which is really, really tricky in terms of when it adds up if you're hiring 30, 40, 50 people a month. And that's just that element, just the background checking. And another reason it's got so much more complicated is because we're hiring people who have moved around constantly. Different countries, different rules. If you're required to do a criminal check on someone for regulatory reasons, for example, but they've lived in 3 different countries in the last 5 years, then you have to do 3 different types of criminal check, and every single country has its own rules, its own regulation, its own legislation, and that goes for references, credit checks, financial checks, all the others as well. And it's just got really, really complicated. The candidates are asked to provide separate documentation for every single check. So rather than just doing a single facial scan, a single document scan, which is then used to do all the checks, they have to submit the same information over and over and over again. Usually it's not integrated into your other systems, and the complexity of compliance, when you combine it with your responsibilities around GDPR and using data safely, but also doing more and more checks, it just gets more and more complicated. So that's why you end up with huge amounts of admin and often not very safe from a data and compliance perspective situation, and it just takes such a long time.
Cool. So I guess then the question we're asking is, how can we onboard more efficiently? And especially more important when we're scaling, when we've got a lot of open roles. And conversely to the first slide, so the slide prior to that Patrick went through, is 4 points that, again, these aren't the be all and end all, but 4 things that hopefully would allow you to improve that onboarding process. And first one, as we've said, is communicate prior to day one. So what does that mean? It's doing those things that I mentioned that typically slowing us down. It's asking for these documents, it's conducting right of work checks, it's sending contracts out, it's telling them where they need to be, it's setting people up on systems if you can do. I would go through, and we do this ourselves, and go through those things that you're currently doing maybe at day one or in the first week, and think, can this be done prior to the new joiner, your new hire starting? Leading on from that, we have onboarding checklists, and again, if we can send stuff around later after the call, we can send some templates that we have that might be quite useful. But having a sort of standard onboarding checklist for every time you hire someone, it provides clear direction for you as a people ops leader. You're doing the same things for, likely most of the things you're doing are the same for new hires. There might be differences around role or where they're located, but the vast amount of things you have to do will be the same. Making sure you nail that down into a checklist, and ideally a checklist that is trackable within a system so that it's automated and you can send tasks, etc. But having that checklist allows you to make sure that you're doing the right things, you're doing them when they should be done, and ultimately it gives direction to your new hire, who can also see what they should be doing and when. And things that might be included is, one-to-ones, so you schedule for that, what training will be required and when, peer meetings that they need to have, shipping out hardware, what mandatory induction they might have to do, and so on and so forth. Next one then around FAQs. So I think typically another thing that we tend to see is most new hires will tend to have the same questions. And this can be an easy one that you can tick off if you don't already do it. But ones like, when am I going to get paid? When do I see my pay slip? On Fridays, do we have a team lunch? All those type of questions that you as a people ops leader or maybe the manager in their team tend to get for every new hire. And creating resources that you can upload into your HR systems that are easily accessible will hopefully deflect a lot of those, gives the new joiner, I guess, independence in finding those answers out. Often tiptoeing around and asking people in your first few days is not the most pleasant thing. You want to be adding value, not asking questions. So by helping people find those answers and writing them down, it saves everyone time. And the final one is the flip side to that, manual processes. And where possible, can you consolidate your onboarding process? Can you reduce the manual tasks? Can you reduce the number of systems? And by doing so, can you save time with things like data, duplication, emails, so on and so forth? And some questions to maybe ask yourself and go through with your own onboarding process is, does my ATS system sync data into my HRIS so I don't have to manually duplicate it? Do I have to request documents manually from my employees, or can I have a process that automates asking them for that and automates reminding them? Do I have to manually share P45 data with my finance team or accountant, or can they see that in the systems that I'm using? Do I have to duplicate data, as we said, into not just HRIS, but other systems, maybe like payroll systems? Do you have to duplicate data into your the systems like Zinc that you're using your right to work checks for, or can you automate that through APIs that your HR system might use? With access management, can you automate provisioning of access, or do you have to go around and ask people in your company to onboard your new hires? And lastly with devices. Where do you buy devices? How do you ship them out? How do you enroll them into MDMs that you might use? Is this you that's doing it? How much time are you spending? Can you automate this? I think if you go through your onboarding process, and there'll be more questions that you might have in your own, and find the answers to that and look at the number of manual tasks that you're doing and can you reduce them. I think positively, there's systems, as you won't be surprised to hear, that will be able to do that for you and help you out. But I think that's a good first step in terms of looking at where there's possible efficiency savings and seeing how you can do that. Next slide. Awesome. So before Paddy goes on to some of the things around Zinc, as I mentioned, you'll be unsurprised to know that there are systems that can help you automate that onboarding journey and reduce those manual tasks. For those that are aware of Zelt or not aware of Zelt, Zelt, as I said at the start, helps companies consolidate their systems. And from a snapshot, that's onboarding, that's adding them into all those things that I mentioned, adding them into P45, payroll. So you can process and pay your payroll. You can equip your team globally. So we have device stores where you can rent devices and we'll ship them out. We have access management as well, integrations with a lot of tools like Xero and Slack, etc., productivity tools. So you can automate the provisioning of access. So that problem that I said around chasing people in your company, once you've connected to something like Zelt, you can automate that provisioning of access. Conscious of time, so I will pass over to Paddy, who can maybe go through some more of the things around Zinc.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, you consolidate with Zelt. Zinc can automate all your background checking. So we work in all 195 countries. Candidates do not hate the experience. They rate it 4.9 out of 5. And we tend to be winning on the customer satisfaction categories. Rather than doing everything manually, we do a couple of steps where we do AI facial recognition, we verify the document, and then we can do nearly all the checks just like that. So rather than 90 minutes a candidate, it's 1 to 3. Rather than 2 to 3 week turnaround on complex checks like references and criminal, we can do it either instantly, like right to work, or in under 3 days. And everything is fully branded and optimized. I guess the most exciting thing, and the reason we're here today speaking about it, is that Zinc is fully part of the Zelt platform. So actually you can use Zinc and do your background checks without even having to leave Zelt. So you really can get that single place where you can do absolutely all of your onboarding as automatically and as quickly as possible. But thank you for particularly bearing with me. Dan was great, but bearing with me as I lost my voice. Got a couple of questions that we're happy to take, but it's a pleasure to have you all, and thank you for sticking through to the end. And I guess we can move to the questions. So if I go to the Q&A section, actually people seem to be doing it on the chat. Konstantina, I believe you asked a question about is face-to-face ID verification still compulsory if Zinc has completed the online verification? So verification of the documents is not compulsory. We're part of the government trust framework. We can give you a fully compliant statutory excuse by doing it online. The only thing you have to do is an imposter check, and that can be done over video or in person, but that's just checking that on day one, the person who turns up is the same person who did the check and not their cousin, best friend, or a random person on the internet. So that's just having a little look on day one and going, yes, you are the same person who did the online check. But you don't need to recheck their documentation or anything like that. But if there's any other questions that people have got around onboarding, around background checks, me and Dan happy to stick on for 5 or 6 minutes. If you don't have any questions, then again, thank you for coming, and we'll hopefully be in touch with some follow-up information. I don't think there's any questions, Dan. I think we answered every question that can possibly be asked about onboarding, which is very impressive. Just give it another 30 seconds. No, I think we did it. I think we answered onboarding. So thank you. Oh no. Thanks, Constantina. Really appreciate it. That's really, really good to hear. Constantina just saying nice things about Zinc, which is always appreciated. Thank you, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll probably do more webinars together, but I hope you all have a great day. I hope none of you get COVID like me, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thanks, guys.